All right, well, we've been 3 weeks now in this series on margin. We're talking about margin. All of us have limits, and when we live to the edge of our limits, we lose margin, right? And we live in a culture where we're just prodded to live to the edge of our limits in our time and in our relationships, and we live to the edge of our emotional limits. We go to the edge morally. We have limits with our finances, but we go right to the edge and we eliminate all margin in our lives. And when we eliminate margin from our lives, bad things happen. Not only do we have no room for the unexpected, when the unexpected expense or the unexpected visitor or the unexpected event comes up, we're just like, whoo, I can't handle that because I have no margin. But more than that, when we live with a lot of margin, we live with a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety. When margin is low, stress is high, right? So we've been talking about margin. And as I've been saying all along, I don't have many original ideas, and this series is no different. I have been borrowing heavily from the work of Andy Stanley, who's done several series on this topic, and I'll be also including a lot of his ideas in this series as well. But today we're going to talk about money. Now, I know that's a dangerous topic to talk about in the church, but we're going to talk about it because a lot of us suffer from a lack of margin in our finances. I know, again, this is a sensitive topic to talk about in church. If you wouldn't consider yourself to be a church person, maybe this is your first time in church in a long time. Maybe you live with the assumption that that's all churches care about. Maybe that's why you're not a church person. That's all churches care about is they want our money. They want my money. And that's kind of the assumption I lived with when I was in my kind of my 20s. And I was just going back to church for the first time in a long time, and I was taking my bride for the first time. She's never really had been to church in her life, and here we were, this young couple, and we're going to check out church, and we had this idea that that's all churches talked about were money. And what do you think they were talking about the first time we went to church? Yeah, money. And we're just like, it's true. That's all they talk about is money. That's all they want is their money. Well, it turns out it was a coincidence that day. They didn't talk about that all the time. And if you're here for the first time today, it's also a coincidence here. We don't actually talk about this every week. And let me just assure you from the get-go, I don't want anything from you. Okay? I do not want anything from you. Your Heavenly Father doesn't want anything from you. He doesn't want your money. He doesn't want your stuff. He doesn't need any of it. But He does want something for you. And that's why we're going to be talking about finances. Let's just start with three things I believe that you'll resonate with, three things that are true of us, three things that are true of our culture, and three things that kind of get us into the place where we have no financial margin. And this is the first thing. Number one, all of us are living on a percentage of our income, and if we don't pick what that percentage is, someone else will. I don't know if you've ever thought about that first part before, but you live on a percentage of your income. And you're like, well, duh. I mean, maybe you've never thought about that, but intuitively it's true. But I bet you probably don't know what percentage you're actually living on, right? Maybe it's 80%, maybe it's 90%, maybe it's 100%, maybe it's more than 100%. But all of us are living on a percentage of our income. And that's not a novel idea. But do you know what it is? Again, for many of us, it's 100%. If I make $52,802 a year, I'm going to spend $52,802 every year. It comes in, it goes out. Some of us, we live on less than 100%. Maybe we're savers and we're givers and we're giving that away. Do you know what percentage you're living on? Others of us, we live on more than 100%. That's because this is one of those rare areas where we have limits, but our limits don't limit us, right? We are limited in our income, but we're not limited in our spending. That's because you could do something interesting with money. You can borrow it. We're very limited in our time. You can't borrow time. We're very limited in our morality. You can't borrow morals. Relational limits and emotional limits, they all have hard, fast lines. But when it comes to our money, while we have limits in our income, we could go and borrow money, which means that many of us can live on more than 100% of what we make, at least for a while. So the first point is all of us live on a percentage of our income. And the second part is, if we don't pick that percentage, someone else will pick it for us. If we're not intentional about what percentage of our income we're going to live on, then marketers or cultural pressure or our neighbors are all going to kind of drive us to spend and to use all of our income up till we get to 100% or more than 100%. So who's picking your percentage? Here's the second thing that I think is probably not probably true, but is certainly true, and that is this. There is a big difference between standard of living and quality of life. Again, this is probably something we all know intuitively. This isn't like a big aha. All of us would say we agree with this. But if you look at the way we live, if you look at the way we spend, if you look at the way we treat our money, we live as though we don't believe this. We live as though we believe that our standard of living is very closely tied to our quality of life. And let's define those two things. So our standard of living would be like the size of my house, the newness of my car, the size of my television screen, how exotic my vacations are, how new and nice my clothes are. That's my standard of living. My quality of life, on the other hand, is the level of joy in my heart, the level of peace, the quality of relationships, how content I am in my heart. That is my quality of life. And there is a big difference between my standard of living, how big my house is, how nice my car is, and my quality of life, how much peace I have and how good my relationships are. But in a consumer culture, we're constantly, in a multitude of ways, being just kind of told that these two things are the same. We're constantly being bombarded with the subtle message, if I raise my standard of living, that I will raise my quality of life. I will be happier. That as the house gets bigger and nicer, that as the car gets bigger and nicer, as the vacations get bigger and nicer, as the television screen gets bigger and nicer, that the quality of my life will be bigger and nicer, and I'll be happier. But most of us, or many of us, have probably traveled enough to know how untrue this is, right? I mean, many of us have been to cultures, developing cultures, where we see people who have a very low standard of living compared to what we have, but a much higher quality of life. We at Newday, we take these mission trips, and we go to places like Peru, and we go to Rwanda, and go to Nepal, and these different places. And you know that we've bought into this, because every trip, people say the same thing. How can they be so happy when they have nothing? I mean, that's always the thing that overwhelms us. How can they be so happy when they have nothing? But what that means is that we've been taught this so long that we just start to believe it, that you can't be happy with a low standard of living. But we think as our quality of life, or let me say this another way. As our standard of living goes up, oftentimes our quality of living goes down. But the opposite is also true. If I begin to create financial margin, my standard of living may go down, but my quality of life will go up. And let's just say, if there is a loving God, if you have a heavenly Father who loves you, what do you think He wants for you? Do you think that He wants you to have a higher standard of living or a higher quality of life? I mean, what do you want for you? I mean, if you really had to choose between the big, nice car and the big, nice house, but a family that was miserable where nobody talked to each other, or the family that was great and everyone got along and everyone was content, but we didn't have all the frills, which would you choose? Now, we're all consumers, so I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, I want both. Right? Why do I have to choose? I want both. And that's what I want to. I know. But if you had to choose, I think all of us would probably choose the higher quality of life rather than the higher standard of living. The last point I think is true of all of us. If I could make just a little bit more, things would be okay. If I could just make a little bit more, another couple $1,000s more a year, or depending where you are, maybe $10,000, $20,000 more a year. If I could just make a little bit more, things would be okay. And that's true for all of us. It doesn't matter if we're making $30,000 right now or $300,000 right now. Everybody in the room is thinking, if I could just make a little bit more, things would be okay. I want to know, why is that? How can that be true for all of us? I mean, because the guy making $30,000, looking at the guy making $300,000, thinking, how in the world could you need a little bit more? But it's true for all of us, and we know it's true for us. If you were able to go back 5 or 10 or 15 years, if you're that old, and look at what you're making 5 or 10 or 15 years ago, chances are you're making more now than you've ever made in your life. Maybe that's not true for all of us. For most of us, it's probably true. We're making more now than we've ever made before. And if you would go back 10 or 15 years, and tell yourself that in 10 or 15 years, you're going to be making what you're making right now, and that you would be anxious about your finances, you would say, no way. If I was making $10 or $20 or $30,000 more than I'm making 10 or 15 years ago, I'm going to be set. But you're thinking to yourself, well, here I am, and I'm not feeling set. I'm feeling a little anxious about my finances, even though I'm making more than I've ever made before. Why is that? Well, that's because our standard of living tracks our income. And the more money we make, the more money we spend, our standard of living goes up and up and up and up, and it continues to match it so that we continually squeeze margin out of our lives. Let me just give this to you in a visual that maybe will be helpful. But let's say that this graph is our income over time, and so the vertical line is how much money we make, and the horizontal line is time as it goes. And for most of us over time, as life goes on, we make more money. The green line is our income. Now, this isn't, it's not a perfectly straight line up and to the right, and I know we hit bumps in the road, and our income goes down, and then we get a big raise. But, for the most part, in an ideal world, this is kind of how it works for most people. The older we get, the more money we make, right? Whether it's inflation, or our education improves, or we get a better job, or whatever, it goes up. Now, the trouble comes when our spending completely tracks our income. As we get the raise, we think, oh, now I can get the new car. As I get the raise, because standard of living equals quality of life, now I can get the bigger house, we got more room, we can keep, upsizing and getting bigger and better. Got the raise, got the bonus at the end of the year, wife got a job, whatever happens, let's just continue to raise our standard of living. But then what happens here is all of a sudden if my income dips, that causes a lot of anxiety. Or an unexpected expense comes up, big problem. If one of those two lines moves in the opposite direction, that's what causes a great deal of anxiety in our lives. Some of us even do this, where we spend more than we make, again, because we can borrow money for so long. And we're living on more than 110% of our income, or 100% of our income. And then again, this goes on for a while, and pretty soon, the credit card company stopped lending money, and then we're really in trouble. Or, again, the unexpected expense comes in, and just stress goes through the roof, or someone loses a job, or the income is decreased, or we get downsized, and then all of a sudden, whoa, the stress is through the roof. But this is what things could look like in our lives, is that over time, as our income goes up, our spending stays down, and we get this thing called margin. Everyone just breathe. Doesn't that just look beautiful? Margin. Is that not what we all want? Margin. No one would argue against that, keeping our spending below our income. Don't we want financial margin? When we have financial margin in our lives, everyone in our family gets along. Everybody has peace. We don't stay up late at night worrying about our bills. We feel generous. We are generous. Life is better with margin. And so why do we live here? Why do we do that? Well, I've mentioned it a couple times already, but I would say one reason we do that is because of consumerism. We've mentioned it a couple times already, consumerism. We are all consumers living in a consumer culture. We're all influenced by it. I'm a consumer, you're a consumer, we're all consumers. Right? And what does that mean? Well, what it means to be a consumer is that I live with the belief that everything I have, everything God gives me, everything I earn, everything I make, everything within my power is meant for my consumption. If God gives it to me, it's for me. It's for me to consume. I'm a consumer. And so it would only make sense that when I get that raise, I increase my standard of living. Why else would God have given this to me had He not intended me to put it to good use? I'm going to get the bigger house. I'm going to get the nicer car. I'm going to get the newer TV. I'm going to buy the newer clothes. Whatever it is, it's for my consumption. But the reality is, God never intended for you or for me to consume everything He gives us. And when we do, when we spend everything that God gives us for our own consumption, we rob ourselves and we rob from God. We rob ourselves. Really, when I live without financial margin, I'm robbing myself. I can never meet my financial goals. I live with a constant sense of dread and anxiety. I stay up at night. I worry about what might happen or how I'm going to pay that bill or how I'm going to make more money to get where I need to be. When I live without financial margin, I rob myself because I bring strife into my family, tension into my marriage, because we all know what we argue about when we live with no financial margins, all about money. Why did you spend that? Why can't we do that? Why can't we make more money? Right? We argue. We're robbing from ourselves when we live without financial margin. We create tension. We lack contentment. More than that, we don't just rob from ourselves, we also rob God when we live with no financial margin. We use for ourselves what was intended for His purposes. And this isn't just a new problem that is just the result of our consumer culture, but this is a problem that the Bible says the people of God have had for a very long time. And so if you have a Bible, I encourage you to open up to the book of Malachi. We're going to be looking at Malachi chapter 3. It's the last book in your Old Testament. Malachi was a prophet of God who God used to give very direct messages to God's people, as you'll see in the short passage we're going to look at. But I would encourage you, read the entire book of Malachi. You will see how direct God is and how direct Malachi is in the short 4 chapters of this book. But we're going to start in verse 7 of Malachi chapter 3, where Malachi writes this. And this is actually God speaking to His people through the prophet Malachi. So just imagine God is saying these things. He says, "Ever since the time of your forefathers, you have turned away from my decrees and have not kept them. Return to me, and I will return to you, says the Lord Almighty." Now, if you were with us a couple weeks ago, you know that we covered this verse in our series on grace. And this is actually an amazing statement of grace from a faithful, compassionate, graceful God. I mean, this is like the understatement of the century. Ever since the time of your forefathers, you've turned away from my decrees and not kept them. For 1,000 years, these people have rebelled against God, have broken covenant with Him, have not done the things He's asked them to do, even though He has continued to be faithful. And the people are still doing it. I mean, if we were to put this in the context of a marriage relationship, these people were adulterous. They had lover after lover. And here stands the husband God saying, I am still willing to take you back. Just turn toward me. That's all I need. Just turn toward me, and I will come back to you, and I will bless you. This is the grace of God. And He's saying, you've always been rebellious. You're being rebellious now. Turn back to me. But these people are just kind of oblivious to their disobedience. They're oblivious to the rebellion. From their perspective, everything's going great. They go to church, and they're doing all the right things from their perspective. And so God anticipates the fact that they're going to have a question, and He says in the end of verse 7, "But you ask, how are we to return?" They don't even know that they've wandered from God. And so they ask this question, what do you want us to do? How are we supposed to return to you? We thought we were already with you. And this is where God gets very direct. He says in verse 8, "Will a man rob God? Yet you rob me. But you ask, how do we rob you? In tithes and offerings." So God tells them, return to me, and I'll return to you. And then He tells them how to return. Stop robbing from me. You want me in your life? You want me to bless you? Stop robbing from me. And they want to know, how in the world do you rob God? How are we robbing you, God? And I think that's just a really great question. I mean, how do you rob God? I mean, where does He keep His stuff? Is there a key under the front mat? Or, I mean, do you hold Him up with a gun? I mean, how do you rob from God? And the people want to know, how are we robbing from you? And God makes it very, very clear. He tells them in so many words that they have been robbing from Him because they have been using for themselves what is intended for His purpose. They were withholding their tithes and offerings. What does that mean? Well, I think we all understand what an offering is. An offering is something that I give to God voluntarily out of gratitude and adoration. When we worship God, we're giving Him an offering. We understand that God has given us so much. He's given us everything. He's given me my life. He's given me my family. He's given me my health. He's given me my home. He's given me the privilege of living in Colorado. He's given me the abilities to do my job. He's given me the abilities to make a living. He gives me everything. And so I give back to Him an offering. It's voluntary. It's an act of love. Maybe it's a financial gift that I give for His purposes. Maybe it's the worship that I give. Maybe it's serving other people. It's our offering. But then He talks about this thing called tithe. That's a little different. Tithe is an idea that God gave his people very early in their history to create margin in their lives, particularly financial margin. And it was intended to demonstrate to them that not everything that he gave them was intended for their purposes. That they were returned to him a portion, a percentage of what he gave them. And so what he's teaching them is, I want you to be percentage givers. I want you to give a percentage back to me, and I want you to be percentage livers. I want you to live on a percentage of what I give you, a percentage that's less than 100%. So the word tithe actually means 1/10. And so God, when he gives them the tithe, when he creates this financial margin in their life, he's actually giving them a percentage. He says, I'm going to give you 100% of everything that you have. It's all from me. It all belongs to me. I'm going to give it to you. And I want you to set aside the first tenth, or the tithe, to give back to me as an act of obedience, because I'm not making this kind of negotiable, and as an act of your faith in me, that you will believe that I can work a miracle in your life to make the 90% that you keep go further than the 100% that you would have kept. And so as the people would return their tithe to God, they would see him working supernaturally in their finances to make the 90% they kept go further than the 100% that they would have. So let's be clear. The tithe wasn't a gift from the people to God, like an offering. The tithe wasn't a way of saying thank you. The tithe was a way of saying, I trust you and I'm obedient to you. Right? Because it already belonged to God. He says it's mine. You're not giving it to me, you're returning it to me. That's mine. That 10%, that's mine. It's already mine. And so when you use it for yourself, God is telling them, you're robbing from me. Right? So, what do the people do? They want to know what to do. They want to know, can we trust God? Will he be faithful to us with the 90% that we keep? And they say no. We're going to use it all for ourselves. We're going to consume it all for ourselves. And so God says to them in verse 9, he continues to be very direct. You are under a curse, the whole nation of you, because you are robbing from me. God doesn't pull any punches. You're under a curse. You're under a curse because you're robbing from me. Now, just remember, this is the God who just a few verses before said, return to me and I will return to you. This is the faithful, compassionate God. Just give me a little bit and I just want to bless you, right? This isn't the God who wants his people to be under a curse. But what is happening is that their crops are scarce at the time that Malachi is being written. Their fields are being devastated by pests. God had promised for 1,000 years, you stay in covenant relationship with me, you're not going to want for anything. I will bless you with everything that you need. I'll provide for you. I will protect you. I'll protect your harvest, your crops. I'll multiply your flocks. But now because of their rebellion, because they were robbing from him, using what belonged to him for themselves, they're under this curse. God could not bless them the way he wanted to bless them. And in the same way, when we rob from God, we push God out of our finances and we say, I've got it. I can handle this myself. It's as though we're living under a curse. God can't bless us the way he wants to bless us. And I want to be careful here because I don't want to give at all the impression that God is like a vending machine that works on some kind of a formula. This is not about like prosperity gospel that as we return our tithes and offerings, that God promises to make us wealthy and happy, and when we don't, God's going to make us poor and miserable. That's not the way it works. But the way it works is, as I return to God what belongs to him, I am demonstrating obedience and faith and welcoming him as a partner into my finances and saying, God, I want you involved. I want you involved in my finances. I want you as a partner in my finances. But when we don't, we're telling him in so many words, stay out, I've got it. But the irony is that when we have no financial margin, one of the things we pray about more than anything are our finances. Right? God, please just help our money stretch a little bit more this month. Or God, if you could just please help us, get that raise. Or God, if you could just help us, get a little more income to make this expense or that expense. God, please help us. We ask God to get involved in our finances while we rob for him and use what's intended for him for ourselves. And so we're asking God to help while at the same time saying, stay out. So many of us in our finances are double-minded. We're sending these double messages to God. Stay out, but help when I need it. And the crazy thing is God says, just return to me, and I'll return to you. That he's just so gracious. Look what he says. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. And you may be wondering, what's the storehouse and the house and all that? The storehouse, actually, this is an agrarian culture. They didn't have money and currency like we did. Most of their wealth came from crops and harvests and flocks and orchards and that kind of thing. So when they would bring their tithe, they would actually bring like a tenth of their wheat harvest or one of their lambs out of 10. I mean, so this was like crazy. So they had to build these storerooms on the side of the temple to hold all of the tithes that the people would bring. And so that's what the storehouse is. That's in God's house. They would actually hold all of this tithe, and then God would then say, this is to be used for the guys who kind of serve me, the priests. It's to be used for the poor and all these different, it's to be used for my purposes. So that's what the storehouse is. And God says, bring the whole tithe. Maybe he's saying whole because maybe they're bringing a part. I don't know. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. Test me in this. Now I'm told that this is the only place in the Bible where God says, test me. Just, come on. Test me. Return the tithe and just test me and see what won't happen. He says, test me in this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that you will not have enough room for it. Yeah. So God says to these people who have been robbing from him, let's get this right. And so he makes this promise. He's not like scolding them or anything. He just says, all right, let's just get this right. He makes them a promise. Return the tithe, and I'll partner with you in your finances. I'll protect your crops. I'll protect your herds. I'll multiply. I'll take care of everything. He tells them and he tells us to test him. Put me to the test. Try me. And let me say, I put God to the test on this every month. Kim and I, every month, first 10% goes to God, right? And every month, we watch him work a miracle in our finances. Every month, we just stand back and say, all right, we watch God as he takes the 90% that's left over and make it go farther than the 100% that we would have kept. And I know many of you are doing the same thing every month. You just kind of set that first 10% aside. That belongs to God. You give it back, and then you watch God bless you. You watch God do miracles. You watch God do things that only God can do. And I'll tell you, there aren't a lot of times when I would tell people to do things financially that don't make sense. I used to be a financial planner and a stockbroker, and I like numbers to add up. But this is the only place where I will ever sit across the table from someone and with no hesitation whatsoever tell them to do something that makes no financial sense. I've had people come to me just battling with this before. I only have so much money left over. I can either pay my tithe or I can pay my car payment to the bank. What should I do? And I always answer the same thing. I cannot answer that question for you. This has got to be your faith, not my faith. But I'll tell you what I'm thinking. I would rather have God as my partner than the bank. I'd rather have God involved in my finances to work out what he can do with the bank than have the bank on my side and be robbing from God. Not everything God gives me is intended for my use and my consumption. God entrusts us with his blessings so that we can be managers of the things he gives us, so that we can be channels of blessing for others and for the work that he's doing in the world. And if we're going to do this well, percentage living and percentage giving are kind of the key. I need to determine what percentage I'm going to give back to God, whether that's 10% or whatever percent you figure out, and what percentage I'm going to live on. What percentage will I give? What percentage will I live on? And when I do that, not only does that make God my financial partner, but it also begins to break down the power of greed and consumption in my life. Here's the thing, is that percentage giving breaks the power that drives us to live at or above our income. I mean, not totally, it's not like I'm ever going to want anything again, but it breaks that power that just drives us to consume when we become percentage givers. And so if you're going to make this work, it means that we start giving more. And if I start giving more, that means I have to start spending less. And as I spend less, I find that the power of consumption starts to be broken in my life. All right? And as we begin to experience more margin in our finances, while our standard of living may go down, our quality of life goes up. Now, again, I know that many of you are probably having an argument with me in your head right now. And there's probably several arguments going on in your head with me right now. One of the arguments is, well, that's great for you or for me or for everybody else, but I can't afford that right now. Once I get to a place where I have margin, then maybe I'll consider this. But right now, there's just no possible way I could afford this. And if you're not a follower of Christ, then just take this as good advice, and you could write this off, and you don't have to follow this. But if you're a follower of Jesus, this is one that we have to get right. This is a non-negotiable. And I would say you have to get that right now while you have no margin. Because first of all, you need to get God on your team in your finances now while you have no margin. And number two, you need to do this now while you have no margin, because this is the only thing that's going to break the power of consumption to get you out of maybe the place of having no margin. And so we can't wait till we have margin to start doing this. We have to start now. We have to trust God to come through now. Now, I also know that many of you are probably having more of the argument like, well, sure, you're the pastor, and I'm very suspicious of any time a pastor asks for money, he's got to have an ulterior motive. He wants a new car, he needs a raise, or maybe they're not paying his salary good enough, and I understand that. I've had those same thoughts. But again, I assure you, I don't want anything from you. God, again, doesn't want anything from you. God wants something for you. I, as your pastor, I want something for you. I want you to experience the joy and the contentedness of what it feels like to live with financial margin. I want you to experience the blessing of what it's like to have God involved in your finances. You know, this is something that Kim and I have taught our boys since the time they were very little. You know, from the first time they started getting allowance, we give them $1, we teach them to give a dime, right? Then they got $5, 2 quarters go to God, right? That was really a pain. I mean, because you got to like get the dime in the tithe envelope and then like seal it so the dime doesn't fall out and everything. I mean, it was really, then the treasurer's got to like, what am I going to do with a dime? I got to like account for this. And then 2 quarters. I mean, so the question is, why would I, as the pastor, teach my kids to do this from a very young age? Is it because the church needs something from them? Is it because I needed a raise, or we needed more money to keep the lights on? That's not why we taught our boys to do this from a young age. The reason we taught them to do this is because we wanted them to grow up learning how to have financial margin in their lives, learning how to involve God in their finances so that they could be blessed, learning how to return to God what belongs to Him so that they could live in partnership with Him. And besides that, if you know how we handle finances at Newday, you know that when you give tithe at Newday, we don't keep a penny of it here. If you get one of those little envelopes that are kind of confusing and you write an amount on the tithe, we send 100% of that away somewhere else, and that money goes to support churches and pastors in the area and around the world. The only benefit Newday gets from tithe is my salary. And you're like, oh, there it is. But no, guess what? My salary doesn't change. I'm paid the same amount as every pastor in Colorado. And, right now, Newday returns a little over $300,000 a year in tithe. I don't make anywhere near that. I make a fraction of that. But the years that we've done $3 or $4 million in tithe, which we have, I didn't make any extra money. I didn't get a bonus. They didn't give me a perk of a new car or anything like that. I don't get any of that, okay? Again, I don't want something from you. I want something for you. I want us all to be able to experience the blessing of what it means to partner with God. And so now some of you are thinking, wait a minute, you're telling me that 100% of the tithe leaves Newday? How do we do what we do here? And fortunately, many people also give to the local church budget, which helps us do what we do here at Newday. But listen, if you're still suspicious about this and you're like, well, I would love to give, but I just don't trust Dave, or I don't trust this church, then just give somewhere else, all right? But just become a percentage giver and become a percentage liver. It's not about the church getting money. It's about God getting our hearts. It's about creating margin. And so when we learn to live with within a percentage of our income, we give ourselves a gift by creating financial margin in our lives. And creating margin in our finances, again, it may lower my standard of living, but it will increase my quality of life. So what do you say? Are you willing to trust God? Because that's what this is all about. This comes down to fear versus faith. Do I have enough faith in God to trust Him more than my bank account? Do I believe, really, that my standard of living and my quality of life are not connected? Do I really believe God enough to believe that He can make my 90% go further than the 100% would if I were to keep it? Do I really believe that God can bless me as I welcome Him to be a partner in my finances? It's on you.